Increase our faith is a request that the disciples have for Jesus, and it doesn't really tell us what they meant by that. And so I think if Jesus stood here today, we might ask him the same thing, increase our faith. And so before we go too far, I want us to define what we mean if we were to ask Jesus to increase our faith. And Jeannie, can I ask you to be my scribe? And just take a little bit, because we're going to come back to this later, and I don't want to forget them. So increase our faith. If we were to ask Jesus that, what do we mean? Never have any doubt. That'll be number one. What else? Or do we just want to stay the same all the time? No? Okay. Okay, so be okay with uncertainty and what seem like unanswered prayers. I like that. Spread the good news. So increase our ability to actually do that.
Faith that the troubles we have will pass away or be gone.
So things are going to get better if things aren't going well. Perseverance. Yep, in the face of tough stuff. Anything else? We got to make a whole list or it's not going to work.
Help us grow in faith.
Grow in faith. So grow, what does that mean? Is that a head thing or a heart thing? Yes, right? So grow in our minds, but also there's something about faith that is feeling and our whole kind of self. So that's good. So should we call that wisdom? I don't know. Maybe that's the wrong word. So trust in the face of what seems unfair. We're writing a whole essay here. This is good. Frank? Keeping the faith. Say more. Say more.
When you have nothing left.
You're
down and out.
Yep. Okay. So staying engaged with our faith practices and keeping that faith even when it doesn't seem like it's working. All right? That's a pretty good list. So we'll come back to that later. You got them all? Most of them?
I'm still working on the last one.
All right, good. So when I was a freshman in college, I'm old enough that email existed, but we did not yet really have email. And I was 3 hours away from home, and you couldn't text, and you couldn't do all the things. So how did I communicate with people back home? Phone? Mail. Now, for those of you that are much younger than me, long distance used to cost money extra on your phone thing. So you didn't do that all the time, so you wrote letters. Now, my mom would send me a letter now and again, and whatever it was she would send me. But mostly, we didn't get a lot of mail. 90% probably 95% of the mail we get at our house now is what kind of mail? Junk, right? Advertisements, credit card things. Bills aren't exactly junk, but they're not pleasant. And so mostly, but if you actually get a real piece of mail, like that someone took the time to write, and that's exciting, right? And I like getting mail like that. And when I was in college, we all liked that, and our mailboxes were all in the same building. And so on the way back from dinner, we would stop by, all open up our mail, and most of the time it was empty, except the guy down the hall, Rob, every day. 2 or 3 like cards, letters, and we were very envious. We was like, gosh, we wish we got mail like you got mail. And that went on for a while, and finally one day he said, listen, you have to send mail to get mail. Because mail is really a conversation, right? There's no guarantee that somebody's going to write you back. But when you write somebody, and like when we get mail, we feel good about it. We're like, oh, I might write that person back now because it's a relationship. And he pointed out to us that if you really want to get mail, you have to send mail. But we didn't want to hear that answer. We just wanted to get mail. We didn't want to do any work, right? We just wanted to be on the receiving end of sort of that gift of correspondence that someone took time to put together. So that is what I think is happening in today's gospel story. The disciples say, increase our faith, right? They have this request, just like we had a desire to get more mail. And Jesus' answer, though, doesn't really seem to answer their request. The first thing he says is, it only takes a little bit of faith, just a little tiny bit, and you could have this tree get uprooted and planted in the sea. But then he starts talking about slaves. And he said, who among you would, after your slave comes in from the field, invite them to sit down and eat with you instead of serve you? And then goes on to say you should consider yourself worthless slaves. Like that's what we should be saying about ourselves. Now, we live in a time where Downton Abbey just came out, the movie, right? And we watch that and see these aristocrats with their servants and think that like that's not who we are. We're not as far away as that as you might think, right? Probably none of us have a household full of servants, but what we've done is figured out a way to share that because they're too expensive for us to have our own. So none of you probably have a gardener that lives in your backyard, but some of you have a person that cuts your grass and takes care of your yard, right? So you share that cost with some other people. So you have someone that serves you. Some of you probably have a pool person. Anytime you go to a restaurant, you're being served by people who are servers, right? That's their role. And so when we hear this story, I think what we should hear Jesus saying, right? We say, increase our faith, Jesus. And he says, well, it only takes a little bit. And then he says, who among you would go down to Restaurant Row here and sit down at dinner and invite the host and the server and the chef to all come sit down and eat with you? Have any of you done that? Like, would we do that? No, because you're going there for them to serve you. Who among you would have your pool person, when they're done cleaning the pool, just come down and sit and eat dinner with you? That's not how it works, right? So when Jesus says this to them, he's not expecting them to go, oh yeah, we do that all the time. They will go, well, no, the servants serve and the master gets served. And so he says, right, so just do what you're supposed to do. Is that the answer they were looking for when they said increase our faith? No, and it almost sounds like he's being really harsh. But I think it might actually be more of a different kind of invitation. So if you think about the whole arc of the story of the Old and the New Testament, so much of it is God inviting God's people into a different way of living, and that different way of living is most of the time some kind of invitation into serving other people. When Abram and Sarai get the call from God to go to a place I will show you, it's so that they can be blessed to be a blessing. They are called to go and serve. When you listen to the prophets, they often are getting on the people of Israel about neglecting widows and neglecting orphans and neglecting people that are poor. Well, how do you not neglect them? You serve them, right? There's a call in there to say you have people around you that need help, you should serve them. Then you get to Jesus, and Jesus comes into the world and actually shows us how to do the whole thing. He walks around and people say, have mercy, and he has mercy and serves their health needs. Have mercy on me, Lord, my loved one died, and sometimes he brings them back to life, but he also sits with them in their grief. And he goes all along serving people everywhere he goes until he gets to the Last Supper. And on Maundy Thursday each year, we read from the 13th chapter of John, where Jesus gathers them all around the table, and then he gets up and takes off his outer garment, and what does he do? Washes their feet. And when he gets ready to wash their feet, Peter says, no, you can't do that. We're the ones that should be the servants, right? You can't wash our feet. You're the one that we follow. And he says, no, this is what I'm telling you. You are to serve one another and love one another, and I'm showing you exactly how to do that. It's not like super complicated. Wash each other's feet, serve one another. Now, what Jesus is really doing there, I think, is showing us what it means to really be the human beings that God created us to be. So he comes into the world and shows us how to be a human being, how to live the path of life, and then we didn't like that because we don't want to do the work, right? We just want to get the mail. And so he gets hung on the cross, but then in the resurrection, he comes back to that new life and then invites us to live in that new life. We don't have to worry about death. We don't have to worry about all of the brokenness. It's still there, right? But Jesus frees us from getting clogged down in that. And then invites us into a life of service. So when the disciples look at him and say, increase our faith, and he says, yes, go serve one another. He's actually inviting them into the path that is life-giving and into the way that he has lived and already shown them how to do that. And he's done all the hard work. He says to them, who among you would invite the servants to sit at the table? Nobody, right? But who did that? Jesus did. When he gathered those disciples, he did exactly what he knew they couldn't do. So when we gather around this table, Jesus is the host, right? He is the Lord, but he has created this for us to gather around as people who serve. And when you're in a congregation for a long time, it starts to just kind of get to be like, most of us are here all the time, and if you're visiting with us today, it's great to have you. You're welcome to join us at the table. But Jesus is the one that actually invites us to the table, so all of us need to remember that we are guests, and we are all servants, and that Jesus is the Lord who has invited us to come eat with him. And in doing that, he continues every time we gather at this table to invite us into lives of service, knowing that those lives of service is where there is, a path to life. Now, this does not mean that we work that service to get God's love. That's already done, right? Jesus already invited us to the table, already died, already was raised so that we can have life. This is just the invitation to live that life. So, we'll come back to the list now. Number one, what was it?
Never have any doubts.
Never have any doubts. Is it easier to just will yourself to never have any doubts or to volunteer for an hour at a food pantry? Right? Now, you have to make the time. You have to find the place. You have to drive over there and actually open up your heart a little bit to serve some people. But that's way easier than trying to figure out how to think yourself out of doubt. What was number two?
Be okay with uncertainty and unanswered prayers.
All right, so okay with uncertainty and unanswered prayers, and we'll rope in the fairness one as well. And right, is it easier to just get okay with things that you don't understand, or to make a meal for somebody who just had a death and needs somebody to just walk alongside them? Make a meal. What's the next one?
Read the news.
Spread the good news. That one's hard. But again, is it easier to tell your story about how God has been in your life, or to try to think through and fully understand all the theology of it and everything else, right? Like, that's a hard one. What's the next one?
Things will get better.
Things will get better. Is it easier to trust that, or to be kind to someone that you're struggling with? I would think it's easier to be kind, right? Because trusting that things will get better is a hard thing. Can you will yourself to any of these things? No, Jesus has to do all that part. So when they say increase our faith, really, they are understanding that they can't do that on their own. And Jesus is just inviting them into a very simple understanding of how then to live into that gift. What else?
Perseverance.
Perseverance, what else?
Grow in our minds.
Grow in our minds and our hearts.
And trust in the face of what seems unfair.
Yep.
Stay engaged in faith practice.
And stay engaged in faith practice. That one we might be able to do. But a lot of this stuff, right, it's way simpler to just go and serve. But then that comes back to the trust thing, and trusting that Jesus actually, this is the path of life, and do we have the faith to do that? And we can't give ourselves that. Jesus gave it to us. So, brings me back to the mail room, right? My friend Rob says you have to send mail to get mail. So, I started to send some mail. I had a few people back home that I thought, oh, I'll send her a letter, I'll send him something. Next thing you know, we go to the mail room. Rob's getting a whole bunch of mail. I'm getting a little bit of mail. And everybody else is still getting no mail. And they look and they said, well, what? And he said, just send mail. Like, this isn't that complicated. So I transferred schools after my freshman year, and I show up there and I continue to write people. And now I go to the mailroom with totally different people who don't know Rob. And I go down to the mailroom and they're all like, well, how do you get all this mail? And I say, you have to send mail to get mail. And then they're like, oh, I don't want to do that. Well, then don't sit around wishing to get mail, right? Like, this is not how this works. And sometimes as people of faith, I think we just want faith, but we don't want to put any work into it. Like, we call that cheap grace. Like, Jesus gives us this stuff. He's done all the hard part. we can then just live into what we have been given. And the other thing I think this can teach us then is that maybe we are God's mail. If you have to send mail to get mail, maybe it is through us that God writes grace into the world. Maybe it is us that are the messengers that carry that grace into the world. And if God sends us in the world as the mail of goodness and grace and kindness and mercy, what's going to happen? Mail's going to come back, right? And it puts us into the relationships where grace just keeps growing and love gets spread and all of the things of spreading the good news happen because God is working that through us. And if we put a little bit of effort into it, it doesn't mean that we're somehow earning it. It just means that we're taking advantage of this thing that Jesus has given us to make the world around us different and to live into the transformation that we have been given. So my prayer this week is that we can go be the mail and trust that God will bring back all of the responses to that mail and steep us in just grace and mercy and love until all people know that God loved them. And then maybe nobody has to send a mail because it's all just everywhere and we're in that space. So we'll continue to pray for that. Amen.